Hey everybody, I'm David Page, and welcome to the very first episode of Culinary Characters Unlocked, where I chat with some of the most incredible people in the world of food. My very first guest is a legendary chef, the winner of a Michelin star and James Beard Awards for, get this, Best Chef, Best Pastry Chef, and Best Restaurant. It's Nancy Silverton. And as you're about to hear, she became a chef pretty much by accident. Chef, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Let me start off with an old expression that has been around for a while. There are those who say, cooking is an art, baking is a science. You are legendary for both. How do you pull that off?
Let's think. Let's start with the baking component of that statement. That idea of baking being a science is what turned me off to baking from my early cooking life. And that said, it started at the Cordon Bleu in London, although I had been cooking a little bit before that. But at the Cordon Bleu in London is where I got my official schooling. And it was there that they really did live up to that baking is science. And that really turned me off. It frightened me. I felt that it was too rigid, and I just couldn't wrap my head or my hands or my palate around the fact that they left such a small amount of margin for creativity, let's say. And so I did not want to be in that sweet side of any kitchen. But unfortunately or fortunately, when I came back from the Cordon Bleu and decided I wanted to work at Michael's restaurant in Santa Monica in 1979, because that was the place to be, and the only opening was in the pastry department, I very begrudgingly took that opportunity just to get my feet in the door. And the rest is history, because I ended up loving it. But that's because I was able to be working side by side by a mad genius, Jimmy Brinkley. And Jimmy Brinkley, on the one hand, respected the fact that eggs curdle at a certain temperature and baking powder has a certain performance when combined with liquid and put into the oven. He understood all that, but he also was able to lead me through that wild ride that once you respected the science behind it, there really was a lot of room for individuality. Jimmy Brinkley was living in Los Angeles when he was maybe 20. If he was 21, he was not much more than 21. And Michael was able to lure him away from what was at that time the best French restaurant in Los Angeles. It was called L'Hermitage. Jimmy was an assistant pastry chef there and made it to Michael's on the opening. Jonathan Waxman then lured him to follow him to open his first restaurant in Manhattan, which was then it was then Jams. I always say that really my luck was only that I was lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time.
But when you're in the right place, you can also make your own luck.
Okay, and maybe you do, but the idea that I was not only at Michael's in 1979, which that was the hottest restaurant in the United States, but then taking what I thought at the time was the risk to be the opening pastry chef, because at Michael's I was just the assistant pastry chef, but I had the opportunity to be the pastry chef at a little restaurant that was called Spago, that was going to be opening, called Spago, with a chef that catered kind of to the stars in Los Angeles when he was at Ma Maison, but really I didn't know him. His name was Wolfgang Puck, and it's like, should I really leave Michael's to go with Wolfgang Puck? And I really dragged my feet on that one, but I finally agreed to go, and really being there and being in the spotlight then is really what jump-started anything that became a success in my life, is that I really owe it to Spago.
Why'd you take the risk?
Because at that time, the chef that was going to be at Spago, because Wolfgang was planning to open this little Italian-y restaurant on Sunset Boulevard that probably had sawdust on the floor and had a musician in the corner. And my future and then ex-husband, Mark Peel, was going to be the chef there. Mark had worked for Wolfgang for a number of years, and Mark left to join the opening team at Michael's as well. And that's where I met him. Anyway, he tried to convince me to move, and I didn't want to do that. And so he did the next best thing is he convinced my mother that I should go to Spago. And so she's the one that convinced me. So that's how I ended up at Spago.
Well, you get someone's mother on your side, it's over.
Yeah.
So you've been to culinary school in Europe. In fact, you went twice, I think, correct? First in England, then you went to France?
Yes. When I went to England, by the way, to go to the Cordon Bleu, it was only because I dropped out of school and my parents were very supportive of it. And it was in my senior year. And my father said, but please, please go to the Cordon Bleu. I didn't even know cooking schools existed, that people went to school to cook. I thought they just cooked in restaurants, nor did I know that there was this highly acclaimed cooking school in our own country, the Culinary Institute. Who knows? Maybe I would have enrolled in that. But anyway, off I went to, yes, the Cordon Bleu in London, because my choice then was to go to the Cordon Bleu was London or Paris, and I didn't speak French.
You later went back to Paris. Did you pick up some French along the way?
I picked up kitchen French, but there's a silent language or a universal language in cooking and in baking. And so you really don't need to know the language to watch the moves and understand why certain things are done in a certain order in a certain way, because the results are that much better.
You mentioned dropping out of college. I've read that you said it happened because you had an epiphany while cooking in the dorm, and you said the light bulb went on.
Yep. I started cooking in my college dormitory very soon after I started college. And my interest in being in the kitchen and cooking in that kitchen was not because of food and not because of needing financial help. It was because there was just the most handsome gentleman I had ever seen, and he was cooking in the dormitory kitchen. And so I told him I wanted to cook. I wanted to work in the kitchen, and how could I do that anyway? So he needed somebody and he hired me, and I started cooking out of cookbooks without any thought of where this will lead, except for hopefully in a relationship with him, which it did, by the way, for a short time. But it was such a moment that it still sticks with me to this day. I don't know how many years later, 50 years later, no, more than 50 years later, of standing in that very stark kitchen, meaning just kind of stainless steel and very institutional and nothing beautiful about it, and thinking, oh, I really do like this, and I think I'm going to be a cook for a living. And that's as far as my goal was being a cook and for a living, thinking that that's what I would do, and it would end there. Because back then, the world of food was not what it is today. First of all, there wasn't a podcast about food. There wasn't any celebrity chefs, as we know. The only cooking show was probably Julia Child's and maybe Jacques Pepin. Cookbooks, a very small section in a bookstore or a library. Kids weren't obsessed. Now at the restaurant, a table will call me over and they'll say, my 7-year-old wants to meet you because she's obsessed with you and she watches all your shows. That wasn't like that in 1974. Plus, probably, I would say 99% of all parents that their child came to them and said when they were in the second semester of their senior year, I don't even want to take my finals. I want to drop out. I just want to cook, would allow them back in the house. Today, maybe, right? Because all of a sudden the parent says, oh yeah, you're going to, host a cooking show, or you're going to have a line of products, and on and on and on.
Which is not what the true motivation for great chefs has been. Now, you got all these kids who think you become a chef to become a TV star.
Exactly.
Look, you talked about cooking because there was a good-looking guy in the kitchen. Julia Child's biography talks about her passionate experiences with the man who became her husband. Ruth Reichel has written that book. There is a passion thing, as I see it, in the lives of great chefs. It doesn't have to be romantic, but it often seems to be. You seem to be people who want to embrace the things that feed your soul.
Yep.
And food is one of them.
Right.
So you're back in the States. You do an apprenticeship, if you will, with Wolfgang Puck and at Michael's, and then you move on to become a restaurateur, and a damn important one. How did Campanile happen?
Campanile happened really because at the time, being married to Mark, who was the savory chef in our relationship, 3 years into Spago being open, 2.5, 3 years, we were kind of given the opportunity to help kind of flamboyant restaurateur open. Did you ever know Warner Leroy, Maxwell's Plum, Tavern on the Green?
Oh, yeah.
He was just so starstruck and so in awe of what was happening at Spago. He wanted to change Maxwell's Plum, which was known as a pickup bar, but very popular and had a very large clientele. He wanted to turn it into the next Spago. So he lured Mark and I with big salaries and big dreams to come do that. And it ended up not working out, that too many of his customers weren't interested in Spago. They still wanted the chicken curry that was on the old menu. So Mark really felt ready to do his own restaurant. I think that if it was myself, I think I would still probably be working for Wolfgang, because I didn't have that desire to be in the forefront or anything like that. And being in the pastry department, first of all, at Spago and then at Maxwell's Plum, I did run my own show, but it was really Mark that wanted to, and we were a couple then. And so I supported that. And that's how Campanile was really born. We took off a month and we rented a house in Tuscany outside of the town of Lucca. It was there that we had just a magical time cooking, shopping locally, making simple meals. And it was there that we also realized it wasn't New York where we could open a restaurant. It would have to be back in Los Angeles, for the simple fact that we saw where all of our inspiration was coming from, and that was fresh, raw, seasonal ingredients like we were experiencing it the summer in Italy at that time. Back in 1988, 89 in New York, you really couldn't find good produce outside of the 3 months of the year where you could shop at the green market. But you saw in all the supermarkets in New York at that time were unripe vegetables coming from California.
So you might as well be in California and get them when they're ripe.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's when we decided we had to move back to California, and Los Angeles was going to be the restaurant. And what kind of restaurant were we going to open? We couldn't open another Spago. Spago was up the street and it was already being done very successfully. And it was there that we sort of developed a hybrid of what we were seeing in the countryside of Italy and what we like to eat and cook back in California.
Well, write-ups, biographies of you that are online and such, talk about the restaurant being notable for California cuisine.
Right.
Define that.
I couldn't help you. I wish I could. I guess as simple and basic and right as it seems, maybe back then people weren't thinking of shop local, shop seasonal. And I guess that's what California cuisine was. Also, I think it was a simpler way of preparing food and eating food, as opposed to, say, in New York, where the influence was still, and I'm talking about a certain level of restaurant. I'm not talking about all restaurants, obviously, but if you got to that sort of mid to lower high end range, I think in New York, it was the French chefs that were really driving those menus.
Jonathan Gold wrote, "It's hard to overstate Campanile's contributions to American cooking." Were you in the kitchen there with your then husband? Were you focusing entirely on baking? Exactly what were you doing?
Well, as the owner, I was everywhere. And yes, I was in the kitchen and I helped to plan the menus. My focus was, because I was running La Brea Bakery at the time, which luckily was in the same building.
Well, didn't you open that to provide the baked goods for the restaurant?
Initially, then it became, what do you call it? The beast and the elephant and the...
Yeah.
It became larger than planned. But yes, it was going to be that bridge or that component that was lacking. I knew I could do good desserts, and Mark knew he could cook good food, but we didn't know where that bread component was coming. So it was sort of the missing link in that perfect menu.
You are credited with being a major inspiration for the whole development of artisanal bread as a thing in America. At the time, there wasn't a whole lot of it in LA, if any.
Well, that goes back to the right place at the right time. So I opened a bakery with the style of bread that I made right at the time where the US was ready to embrace that style of bread. And so I got all that credit, which is great. It doesn't hurt. However, I did not invent bread. And then some journalists went on to say I was responsible, to bringing bread to and it's like, well, I think it was, bread's been around a little bit longer than but it's true. Look at my inspiration. My first bite of that apple in the Garden of Eden that led me down that path was having the bread at Poilin Bakery when I returned to France to go to cooking school. And my friend, I'll never forget my friend that said, I've got to take you to taste the best slice of bread you'll ever have. And I jumped on the back of his motorcycle and off we went to Poilin. And there I had this slice of bread, something of the likes I had never seen before. And in my mind, I bought into that French theory that bread cannot be made outside of France, good bread, because we don't have the flour. Just like the New York bagel makers like to say, bagels cannot be made outside of New York because you don't have the right water. And so I bought into that and I thought, okay, too bad. I guess I have to come to France for my bread fix. And it was in returning to United States after those few months in France, where I went up to Berkeley and I went to Acme Bakery. And I'm like, wow, that looks like the bread I had in Paris, and it is being made in the US. And therefore, one day I'm going to figure out how to make that style of bread. So I would say if anybody gets that credit, it would be Steve Sullivan from Acme Bakery. Now, little did I know that on your coast in upstate, I think it was upstate New York, a gentleman named Michael London had already been obsessed with making bread of this kind. And the person that was making excellent bread also around the same time as Steve Sullivan and Acme, but again, I was on the wrong coast, was Dan Leader from Bread Alone, somewhere in New York. I forget where. And he's still, I think his company still exists. And I think, or for a while, you were still seeing a version of it at the Green Market. He's written a few books, Dan Leader, excellent bread maker. So there was Dan Leader and Michael London on the East Coast, and there was Steve Sullivan on the West Coast. And then I popped up.
We had the appropriate wheat, or was this flour being brought in from Europe?
We had the appropriate wheat. And as you see, especially with all of the bread bakers these days that are only buying domestic wheat and buying it from some that are such small farms and new ways of growing the wheat and heirloom varieties. The whole bread baking world has just also changed and become so much more interesting. But what I do have to say about maybe why I contributed to that artisanal, as we call it, bread beginnings, and why I got the amount of attention that I did, is that I really did start to bring in so many different varieties of bread. I think like the Dan Leaders and the Michael Londons and even the Steve Sullivans at Acme Bakery were pretty much making a baguette and say a mixed grain loaf and a white loaf. And that was kind of it. And then I started really playing a lot and bringing in a rosemary olive oil loaf and a black olive loaf and a potato and dill loaf and a chocolate cherry loaf. And that's what started getting the attention, the way you could play with the bread. But I also have to say that at that time, there wasn't, YouTube, and there wasn't Google, and there also was not a cookbook to turn to or really a baker to talk to unless you wanted to go to Berkeley or the two locations up in upstate New York. And so I really did have to figure out that science in the way that a scientist really would have to work from scratch, meaning I would start with a tablespoon of this and a teaspoon of that, and then have to wait that 24 hours or 48 hours for a result. And that was frustrating. You work on a chocolate chip cookie, you mix your dough, you shape it, you put it in the oven, and in 45 minutes, if you passed or failed, right? Bread is like a very slow answer, but that was the part that I think was really exciting. If I had the Google or the YouTube or the books or the bakers to talk to, I'm wondering if I would have gone or gotten as far as I would have gotten, because I tried everything, and many things that I learned, like I don't know how many times I tried, say, a simple white bread until I came up with the formula that about 2% salt seems right. And that was like completely on my own with, let's say, 50 tries. And now all you have to do is look up on a baker's manual, what's the appropriate amount of salt in a bread? Because we know that salt has scientific properties, right? And besides just giving it flavor, there's other things that will happen with too little or too much salt. And then you'll see 2% salt is the right amount of salt. It was those kinds of things that I discovered on my own through a lot of trial and error that have scientific reasoning behind that.
You're credited with being one of the first to do sourdough, and then seeing half of America making sourdough during the pandemic. Any thoughts about that?
Sure. I didn't have the need to bake during those times. And so I made a peanut butter cookie instead and then wrote a new cookbook.
The name of which is?
The Cookie That Changed My Life. I wanted the title to be The Peanut Butter Cookie That Changed My Life, but marketing and my publisher said there's too many people that are allergic, that have peanut allergies. You can't call it that. But what I found really fascinating about not only the amount of people that were baking sourdough bread in 2020, I saw all the reasoning behind it. First of all, there's nothing more soul satisfying than crafting a great loaf of bread. It just brings from the inside out so much pleasure. I also saw that people will say things like, oh, I just love that, the idea of bread baking, but I don't have the time, so I can't do it. And all of a sudden, people ran out of excuses. And so they were like, uh-oh, I can't say I don't have the time anymore because I have nothing but time. So here I go. But I saw the community the communities that they formed, both by talking to people about how to make bread, to giving away bread, to opening up pop-ups out of their kitchen. That was like the gift that kept on giving in so many ways.
Well, thank you for helping kick that off. I should point out that when you were at La Brea Bakery, you won the James Beard Award as outstanding pastry chef in the country.
Yes.
What did it feel like to have somebody important say to you, you are officially the best at this?
Well, I'll tell you, when those awards came out, the restaurant/bakery opened in 1989. So I think that it was the first official awards ceremony of the James Beard Foundation in 1991. So I didn't even know. I mean, I knew who James Beard was. And by the way, he wrote a book. He did write one of those books, Beard on Bread, but he wasn't making sourdough bread. And so I couldn't really follow anything in his book. But he did have a book called Beard on Bread because he had a book on everything. But those awards didn't have the cachet that they have now. Back to those generation of people that want to get into cooking. It's, I want to be a TV star and I want to be a James Beard Award winner. But back then I didn't even know what they had just started them.
It was like the 1929 Oscars.
Exactly. It's like, oh, I love medals,
Later, you would win Best Chef in the whole damn country in the James Beard Award.
But before that, Campanile won Outstanding Restaurant, which that was really an honor because there were so many restaurants. And already then these awards were something that, it's like, haha.
Well,
but yes, back then it was like, wow. And it was funny because when those awards were given out, first of all, they were nominated by just a handful of journalists. And I don't even know who voted for him, but I know that I was against two, actually, New York male chefs that were much more accomplished than I was. Albert Kuman and Jacques Torres, who we all know who he is. He not only is a fantastic chocolatier and everything else, but he made the best chocolate chip cookie that the whole world makes now, including myself. Anyway, I was up against those two, and it was just so interesting that I, being a female, which there wasn't that many back then, but not nearly as accomplished, was kind of recognized for possibly having influence in kind of changing that old world
mindset?
yes, to maybe the new world. And that's what I was probably recognized for, not to the happiness. And I teased her about it. She's no longer alive, so I can say that. But the woman that announced my award, Madeline Kamen, she taught in Boston and she wrote some of my favorite cookbooks, When French Women Cook and The Making of a Cook. Fantastic. She was given the honor of reading that award. And when she saw that I won, she turned pale. I think she almost passed out. And to say that she was not happy about it was because I wasn't French. She didn't care that I was a woman, but I don't think she really understood what I was trying to do in the pastry world at that time.
Well, let's deal with the being a woman thing briefly before we move on to other elements of your career. The food world has not been the easiest or nicest place for women to achieve in or to have their achievements celebrated. I mean, the 50 best restaurants list, which is highly controversial, hardly includes women chefs anywhere and has condescendingly a category called best female chef.
Yeah.
Are things getting better? Are they, given the tenor of the times, still lagging painfully? What's your view on how the food world treats more than half of the population?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that I'm from California. California is not and has never been like the rest of the country. So had you said to me or asked me, so who were your earliest heroes? I would have given you a long list. And then you would have said, but they're all women. It's like, oh, well, I guess they were. I would have said Judy Rogers and Barbara Trapp and Joyce Goldstein and Mary Sue Milliken and Susan Feniger and on and on and on. And it's like, they're Alice Waters, right? They're all women. And yet in California, for some reason, maybe because we're very open-minded, being a female in the kitchen and being a cook didn't prevent you from becoming successful, a leader, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, when I was at Spago, when the success happened almost immediately and the press were just coming in, and I remember the first journalist that came to me and said, so let me know, what is it like to be a woman in the kitchen? I remember looking at her thinking, is something wrong with me, but I don't understand that question, you know?
And looking at her, by the way. So, yeah.
Yeah, looking at her thinking, why are you asking me this? Because my only history was working under Jonathan Waxman, who couldn't care less who you were, just as long as you did a good job, to Wolfgang Puck, who also didn't care who you were as long as you did a good job. So I didn't even know that there was an issue. As I continued in the culinary world, I learned that I'm unique, and that wasn't the case for a lot of people. So firstly, to answer your question, well, first, the idea of why there are not more female chefs being represented in these things like 50 Best Chefs of things like that. If you did look at the ratio between men and women in the kitchen who have their own kitchen, you know, there's going to be more men no matter what. And so the awards are going to be skewed that way. You know, I don't believe in throwing in a woman just to even out the equality if the standard is not the same. There's no compliment, I don't think, to be getting an award, getting a good write-up, being included in something just to make it balanced. I think you also, no matter who you are, no matter what kind of food you cook, that it's at the level that should be awarded. So that's one other thing. But yes, the last several years, handful of years, in particular, the hospitality industry is looking outside, inside, and figuring out how to fix a lot of this injustice. And so, yes, I think kitchens are becoming better places to work. There's less of that French screaming. People are being respected. People are not asked to work in a manner and commitment that is not healthy. And people, I think in general, yes, are being, have a place to voice when things are not being handled correctly. So yes, we're coming a long way. And yes, it was a movement that needed to happen. I myself have not had to struggle with a lot of the issues that other people have struggled with.
After Campanile and La Brea Bakery, your next career milestone was Pizzeria Mozza and Osteria Mozza. Why Mozza?
So mozza was short for mozzarella, which I'll tell you after. I want to just tell you because it's funny how many people mispronounce the name. And then I'll tell you why mozza. So it is mozza, short for mozzarella, but a lot of people will come up to me and say, I love your restaurant mozza. And then I'd like to say either I don't say anything or I don't correct them or I don't say it's not a Jewish restaurant, right? But people, a lot of people mispronounce mozzarella and they say mozzarella. So maybe that's why. But the reason is this. I left Campanile and La Brea Bakery after I don't even remember how many years, at least 15, but more than that, I think, because my marriage also split up and it wasn't easy to have a non-marriage and still be co-chefs at a restaurant. But I wasn't at all ready to throw in the towel and find something else to do. But I didn't know what that next restaurant would be. And it was on a trip to Italy, which I had then already had a house, or a summer in Italy, I should say, where I owned a house. I made another mistake / not mistake by inviting Jeremiah Tower over to my house for lunch because he was then living in Umbria. And I hung up the phone and I thought, what the heck did I just do? I invited Jeremiah Tower, who I barely knew, to my house for lunch.
One of the greatest chefs in history. Yeah.
Yeah. And what am I going to make? And so I decided that as I would give advice to anybody, when you don't know what to cook and you're nervous, don't try to cook to impress. And so I had just been to a tiny little caseificio, a cheese caseificio that produced their own fresh cheese from their cows on the property. And so that's what I had in my refrigerator. So I decided that I wasn't necessarily going to cook, but I think I was going to assemble a meal, making mozzarella the star and doing all these little condiments that would help to elevate or be supporting actors to the mozzarella. And so that's what I did. I laid out a spread and Jeremiah and I had a lovely lunch. And at the end, he gave me a terrific piece of advice but previous to that, he complimented me and said, this is probably one of the loveliest lunches I've ever had. I think it was lovely because the company was good, the setting was good, and the food did not get in the way of the conversation. You know, sometimes the food is just so in your face, you can't really talk. So I didn't take it as a compliment as that you're the world's greatest cook either. But he did say to me this, do you ever go to Rome? Because my house is about a good hour and a half from Rome. And it's like, sure, every year before I get on the plane to go back, I spend a couple of days in Rome. He said, do yourself a favor, stop in at a place called Obica. It's a mozzarella bar, or it's a restaurant that has only a mozzarella bar, and they do all sorts of things with mozzarella, and I think you'd like it. And so I thought, well, what a great idea. And so on my way back to the United States, in Rome, I went by Obica. It was opened by an Italian that fell in love with the idea of sushi bars and thought they could make their version of a sushi bar using mozzarella. But it was brilliant and nothing was cooked. It was just kind of assembled. So it was a very long menu, but it was very simple.
And you took that idea.
I thought, this is brilliant. Yeah, so I came back to Los Angeles and I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up a mozzarella bar. It's going to be just me. I'm going to make everything. I'm going to be behind the counter. And I was excited, and I told Mario Batali then about this idea, and immediately he was like, I'm doing it with you. I'm bringing out my partner Joe Bastianich and we'll figure it out. And so my little dream of being a one-woman show turned into what's now become sort of an empire. So hence mozza from mozzarella.
You have all sorts of mozzarella dishes on the menu there. Where do you get the cheese?
Well, luckily, at one point I thought that we would just stretch it ourselves, but we have a fantastic local cheesemaker, and his name is Mimo Bruno, and his company is called Di Stefano, and he makes lovely fresh mozzarella and fresh burrata. And I had already been using his cheese at Campanile, and he likes to say, I didn't know it, but I was the first person that would buy his burrata in Los Angeles, which now has become a national requirement on every single menu, no matter what type of cuisine you have. Everybody uses burrata, but it was unheard of. I used to have to explain it to every single customer what burrata was, and he couldn't even sell it to the handful of Italian restaurant owners in Los Angeles because they had never heard of it either, because burrata was a regional specialty of Puglia. Bufala, everybody knew, Bufala milk mozzarella and mozzarella, but nobody knew burrata. Anyway, so we use his local burrata and mozzarella, and we also import Bufala from Italy and some burratas from Italy.
I would describe burrata as mozzarella, but the inside is filled with milk or cream.
That's a good way to describe it.
How is it made?
Basically, it was a byproduct of making mozzarella. And the reason why it was a byproduct is, by the way, the word mozzarella comes from the verb mozzare, which means to break or to twist. So when the mozzarella maker is hand making, I should say, or hand shaping mozzarella, because now most of the companies, the big companies, it's all automated. But if you thought about the old school mozzarella maker that had his pot of heated water and was stretching the curds of mozzarella into mozzarella, right? And then twisting off those balls to make that twist to shape, there was a lot of excess strands that fell to the bottom of this big vat. And so somebody came up with the idea of gathering those bits and stretching them into a skin and encasing the mozzarella strands and incorporating them, as you said, with cream. So these strands were incorporated, this byproduct, kind of like the way ricotta is a byproduct, right, of mozzarella. That's the reheated whey of the cheese with a little rennet to make it coagulate. This is kind of a byproduct. Originally, now people just make burrata because the demand is so high, but it used to be a very small byproduct production. And it's probably one of the newest cheese into the cheese family. It's probably only about 60 years old.
But it's representative of certainly European cuisines and regional cooking, where the ethos was don't waste a thing.
Exactly.
Now, you obviously did more than cheese, because it was here that you won the James Beard Award as Best Chef in America, which had to feel pretty good.
That felt pretty good. By then, like I said, years later, it was like the real Academy Awards.
And you have a Michelin star at the restaurant. Yep. What, if I walk in for dinner, beyond this incredible mozzarella bar, what kinds of foods am I going to get? Are they from various Italian regions?
I would say they're predominantly Emilia Romagna and the Umbrian Tuscan area, because that's what I'm the most familiar with.
If only you could get those incredible plate-sized mushrooms I have enjoyed in Tuscany, funghi porcini.
Well, we get funghi porcini.
The big ones? The real ones? The not dried ones?
Yeah. They come from the Pacific Northwest, yeah.
Oh my God, I had no idea.
The first time I ever had them was that month that I rented the house between Campanile and Maxwell's Plum, where I had porcini that was wrapped in tinfoil, aluminum foil, and it was baked with, there's a wild mint that grows in that area called Nepetella, and it's nothing like the mint we think of, the domestic mint, I should say. It has a much, much more complex flavor, but it's the mint and that Nepetella and porcini that was wrapped up in aluminum foil and thrown in a wood-burning oven. It was that and another dish that I had never had before that we had on the menu at Campanile that put Campanile on the map, which was pollo alla matone, which is spatchcock chicken cooked under the brick. So it's a flattened chicken, basically, where the whole skin gets crispy because it's weighted under something heavy and its whole surface is exposed to the heat. But those funghi and that Nepetella together is a winning combination that you can't get because we don't grow Nepetella.
You opened Pizzeria Mozza. What motivated that?
I didn't grow up as a pizza lover, and I didn't grow up in a pizza eating family. None of the heartfelt memories like a New Yorker or a Chicago. New Yorkers, they go on and on about the slice of pizza and what pizza should be. And, same with, Chicago with deep dish. Pizza was never a Los Angeles sort of icon. I don't know, I'm so bad when you ask me when was that, but several years ago, I would say, let's say 20 years ago, I was invited to Suzanne Goen, another very prominent chef in Los Angeles who also worked for us as a chef at Campanile for a couple of years. She got married at Chris Bianco's restaurant, Pizzeria Bianco in Phoenix. And it was there that I finally ate a piece of pizza that I thought, okay, now I get what pizza is supposed to be. Now, this was way before I had good pizza in Naples, and there was, nobody was doing Neapolitan pizza in the United States or anything like that. But what I had of his was, oh, I get it. And I put that in the corner of my brain, or I replaced the corner of my brain where I had stuck that slice of poêlin bread where I said, someday I'm going to figure out how to make this bread. I replaced it with, someday I'm going to figure out how to make pizza. But sometimes you just need the reason to make it. And the reason to make it was in looking for this location for Mozza. It was a restaurant that had two components. It was a large restaurant where now our osteria is, but next door it had an adjoining pizzeria. And although the leaseholder of the restaurants didn't want to give up that pizzeria, I said, I will take the whole thing or nothing, because I wanted to force myself how to make my pizza or my version of Chris's pizza. So that is why pizza is there. And it was at a time in Los Angeles, again, I would say the third time of me being at the right place at the right time, that I opened this pizzeria where chefs that had restaurants at my level did not have pizzerias. Now they all do. They all have their trophy restaurant and a pizzeria because that's what they really want to eat. And so I too got a lot of accolades for having it. Now in Los Angeles, there are so many pizzerias and so many of the kind of, not necessarily the style, but the level of service that accompanies a wine list that people of all ilks go to eat, that I'm so outnumbered by what's available now. But we opened this pizzeria. It's now going on 18 years.
And highly, highly acclaimed.
Still very close to my heart.
You said, quite rightly, you have a culinary empire at this point. Your restaurants are in other countries. You have multiple restaurants in the States. You're opening a new pasta bar. What do you see down the road? I see myself kind of continuing what I love, which is the hospitality business. I really love the interaction, and I really am ingredient obsessed. I see something new and I can't wait to see how I can transform it into a dish, right? And that urge and that thrill is still so strong within me. And just the relationship that I have with the other cooks and the joy I get from mentoring is still so strong that I think I'll just really be doing this forever. People say, well, look at, why don't you just stop? And I think stop and do what? Because this is what I want to do every day. Well, on behalf of everyone who loves great food, please keep it up and thank you.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute delight chatting with you, Chef.
A delight talking to you as well.
The remarkable Nancy Silverton, just the first in a long line of fascinating folks I'm talking with here on Culinary Characters Unlocked. Like the guest on my next episode, legendary restaurateur Drew Nieporent, who partnered with Robert De Niro on Nobu and the Tribeca Grill. Here's a taste.
Bob wants to know if you want to open another restaurant in Tribeca. And I was like, this is crazy, So De Niro and I walked up the block, and he showed me the space, and it was like this huge, cavernous, amazing space. Amazing. It was an over-the-top, huge success. And then we brought in Sean Penn, Bill Murray, Mikhail Baryshnikov, Christopher Walken, Ed Harris.
As investors.
As all investors. And that was a kick in the butt. I'm signing these sheets, and it's my name and Sean Penn.
Drew Nieporent, my guest on the next episode of Culinary Characters Unlocked. I'll see you then.